And here we go. Oops. Hi, I'm Diane McGarry with Drake Arts. With me today are co-host Tom McGarry, author Katherine Howe, and ASL interpreter Mary. Katherine is a New York Times best-selling and award-winning novelist and historian. Her most recent books are Astor, The Rise and Fall of an American Fortune, co-authored with CNN's Anderson Cooper. A novel, a true account, Hannah Masury's Sojourns among the Pyrates, and Katherine's going to be reading from that a little bit today, and it's written by Hannah herself, of course. And the Penguin Book of Pirates, an edited volume from Penguin Classics. She holds degrees from Columbia, Boston University, and the University of East Anglia. I never pronounced it right. Anglia, and is a fellow for the Society of American Historians. She lives in Baltimore and New England, where she is at her work on her next novel. So I understand you're going to share some wonderful stuff with us today.
I am. I'm so excited to be here with you. Thank you so much for having me. My plan is I'm going to read some of my most recent novel, which is called, and I love long, wordy titles. It makes my editors crazy. This one is called A True Account, Hannah Masury's Sojourn Amongst the Pirates, written by herself. And the reason that it has such a long, wordy title is because in the 18th century, which is when this story takes place, it takes place in 1726, which is near the end of what we might call the golden age of piracy. And the novel as a form was actually very new in that time period. And oftentimes, if you look at fictional works that were published in the 18th century, they have these long subtitles. So the story of Tom Jones, for instance, the subtitle of Tom Jones is A Foundling. And as you read in A True Account, the question of authorship is sort of at the center of the story to some degree. I don't want to give too many spoilers away, but there is a pirate story that takes place in 1726, and then there's a framing narrative that is set in 1929. And so my plan today, I was remarking to the people who invited me to come to Drake Arts a moment ago that usually I give book talks. I don't usually read very much. So it's kind of exciting to have the opportunity to just read some of Hannah's story to you. I might interject comments here and there if I feel like I need to clarify something. But basically, my plan for today is to just read aloud to you the beginning part of A True Account. That's all right. So that's what I'm going to do.
It's a wonderful story.
Thank you. Chapter 1, Boston, June 1726. I don't know what made me determined to go to the hanging. I'd always made a point of avoiding them. I resisted the entreaties of my friends who wanted to be in amongst the throngs of onlookers, ears pricked for the last words and the pious advice of the soon-to-be damned. Of course, I'd always been curious. You cannot help but wonder about the face of one condemned, to see his carriage toward the crowd and himself, to feel the swelling cheers and cries of all the townsfolk, to hear the crack of the felon's neck snapped like a chicken's. I wondered if their eyes were open or closed when their moment came. What happens in the instant in between being a living, breathing creature, trembling with needs and wants and fears, and being an empty sack, flesh and bone? Is it the same for an old woman alone in her bed with the covers pulled up tight as it is for a man mounting the scaffold before God and everyone? Does an unearthly light of heaven attain to shine upon the greasy strings of their hair if they have confessed and repented? Everyone repents at the end, or so I've been told. I'd heard the moment of public death described often enough, usually by someone with a hand around a glass. But I'd always been of too delicate a nature to see for myself. I didn't like to drown kittens or stomp tremble-whiskered mice, and as often as not found a way to avoid such grim chores on the occasion Mrs. Tomlinson chose to impose them on me. I even crossed the street from dogs lying dead in the gutter. But something about William Fly was different. I made up my mind that I would go. Summer wears long on the Boston wharves, with early sunrise and late nightfall dragging its feet to deliver our relief. And so the afternoon was stifling in Ship Tavern when I first heard the name of William Fly. Now, here I'm going to give you an aside. William Fly was a real person. He was actually hanged in Boston and was the subject of a very public both hanging and then later a published account of his turn to piracy. And so what I describe of William Fly's appearance and William Fly's actual moment of hanging is taken from the historical record. He was a real person. So I'll tell you more about him when we get through the book. But the way that I approach historical fiction is typically to have a fictional person like Hannah Masury encountering real experiences. I saw a note that someone was having trouble hearing me. Are you able to hear me okay? Yes? Okay. I want to make sure everyone can hear. Okay. And so the afternoon was stifling in Ship Tavern when I first heard the name of William Fly. Ship Tavern, incidentally, was also a real place. By 1726, it was already almost 100 years old. It's no longer extant in Boston. But one thing that was interesting to me to think about Hannah's moment in time, the 1720s, well before revolutionary Boston, it was already feeling like a relatively old space by North American standards. The ordinary was generally tolerably cool in summer, being a dim cavern of rooms built of ancient brick, squatting like a naiad's grotto for almost 100 years at the foot of Clark's Wharf. Ship Tavern stands close enough to the harbor waters that a brig can moor nearly at the lip of our door. Well situated to swallow up the passing seamen as they tumble ashore, land sick and looking for all the things sailors look for when they've been long at sea. But that June day, the sun shone especially heavy, bleaching the color out of the air and leaving us all wilted and damp. Inside, the usually cool hollow of the larger dining room had warmed by degrees until it felt like the inside of a beehive oven. The sand on the floor was hot underfoot. The front door stood open, propped to catch any whisper of a passing breeze, but the water in Boston Harbor was as flat and slick as molten glass. I was sitting on an old apple barrel outside, leaning on the brick wall of my home and place of employ, my skirts knotted up to my shins to get some air on my bare and aching feet. The apple barrel, incidentally, is an illusion. If you have read Treasure Island, which is kind of the classic, most classic American pirate story, although it's not set in America, the moment that Jim Hawkins learns that he is actually shipped away on a pirate ship, that the Hispaniola is really a pirate ship, he's hiding inside an apple barrel. And so this apple barrel, which eventually Hannah will be hiding inside as well, is an allusion to Treasure Island. I should have been getting back inside to stoke something or serve something or carve something or scour something. Inside the tavern, a few men lazed indolently about, looking into their cups, waiting for the day to end. No one was calling my name. Mrs. Tomlinson was, I knew not where. As I gazed up the narrow length of Fish Street, I spied not a living soul, save the odd gull perched on a piling, or tabby cat slithering amongst coils of rope in search of rats. My heels bumped on the hollow barrel. I packed a small wad of tobacco and hemp into the slender clay pipe someone had left behind in one of the rooms, sparked it with a few sucks of my cheeks, and settled back to stare over the water, smoke coiling from my lower lip up into my nostrils. Clark's Wharf is nearly as long as Long Wharf, but older. Half a dozen snows and brigs and a couple of little schooners and sloops rubbed their hulls against the pilings, their lines and rigging creaking. Sails all furled and put away. No one was about. No bent-over boys scrubbing any decks or barefoot figures climbing rigging silhouetted by the sun. Even the gulls were quiet. The water shimmered away to the horizon, low ridges of the harbor islands rising through the orange and yellow summer haze. I closed my eyes and wished for a ripe apple. Cut his hand off, I heard someone say softly. So softly, it might have been spoken in my mind. I opened my eyes, but saw no one. Off with what? Another voice said in an accent that hinted at time in Jamaica, so not inside my head after all. I got off the apple barrel, ears straining to listen. The voices hadn't come from inside the tavern. Fish Street was as abandoned as it would be after the rapture. broadaxe, said the first, who was from somewhere that wasn't Boston, as he clung to the main sheet hanging over the side. Someone laughed merrily. I could hear them clear as a church bell, but where were they? Presently, I discerned the shape of a small rowboat emerging from the haze, its oars dipping and rising in circles. The rowboat contained 2 boys about my own age, 17 or so, not more than 20, in sun-whitened shirts and breeches. The one pulling on the oars wore a checked handkerchief over his head to keep the sweat from his eyes. His companion, the Jamaican, wore his knotted around his neck, his hair in tidy twists all over his head. They edged close to the nearest moored brig, and the boy with his back to me leaned on an oar to clear the stern. I could have gone to help them tie up, but it was too hot. Instead, I sat back on the barrel and drew on my new pipe. That's one way to discharge your sailing master, the Jamaican said with gravity, handless into the deep, 1 o'clock in the morning. I knew that, John Green, his mate, the not Bostonian, continued, their captain at Port Royal. The rowboat bumped up to the piling almost exactly below my idle feet, grating against the barnacles. The not Bostonian sprang ashore with a line in his hand and made it fast. I tried to make a ring with my smoke to watch them through, but it came out a cloud. And, the Jamaican said as he lifted himself out of the rowboat, landing on his hands and feet on the wharf like a cat. And if I could, I'd have handed William Fly the axe myself, said the not Bostonian. Can we get something to eat? This last remark was apparently directed at myself. I decided that if I wasn't actually addressed, I needn't respond. This boy was pale and reddish, his cheeks spotted pink with the heat, and he mopped his streaming face with his kerchief and re-rolled a sleeve while I ignored him. He begged, the Jamaican asked, paying me no heed. Sweat beaded on his whiskerless upper lip. They were both standing close enough to smell. They'd let him choose, they said. Would he leap like a brave fellow, or would he be tossed overboard like the sneaking rascal he was? And he cried, "For the Lord's sake, boatswain, don't throw me overboard," the not Bostonian mimicked, clasping his hands beneath his chin, eyes beseeching imaginary tormentors. "For if you do, you throw me into hell immediately." So all of what the boys are recounting at this point, I took from the historical record, from what people said when they had a mutiny, when William Fly led a mutiny and turned to piracy. The 2 boys dissolved in laughter, and through gasps and tears, the not Bostonian added, and Fly said, "Damn you, since he's so devilish godly, we'll give him time to say his prayers, and I'll be parson. Now say after me, 'Lord, have mercy on my soul,' and then the people chucked him over." Ah, that would have been a sight to see. His mate clapped his hands in delight. Turning to me, he added, "Here, now the boy asked you a question. We want to eat." I swiveled my eyes over to the 2 of them, letting my gaze rest upon their faces long enough for them to feel that they were interrupting my idle afternoon. If they felt any remorse at troubling me, they surely didn't show it. I unfolded myself from my sentry post, knocked the ashes out of my pipe, and slid it into my pocket. "Oh, certainly, your lordships," I said, joking as was my wont with the cabin boys who came my way. "Right this way, your grace." I stepped through the open front door, not bothering to see if they were following. It never ceases to amaze me that hungry sailors will willingly stop at the first ordinary they see, no matter how many rats might be fattening themselves in the cellar. "But what of the mate?" the Jamaican boy continued to his friend as they followed me into the largest dining room. He moved with a sailor's bow-legged gait. Inside the tavern smelled of boiled lemons and rum and roasted chicken grease and burnt wood and tired men. "Thomas Jenkins," the other boy said. He was taller but thinner. "Cut at the shoulder with the broadaxe, then flung overboard by the main shrouds." "No," cried the Jamaican, loudly enough that a pickled gentleman in a ripped greatcoat stirred in his sleep across the table. He cried like a girl, "For the Lord's sake, fling me a rope," mocked the pink-cheeked not Bostonian. "Doctor, doctor, a rope, a rope." I stopped abruptly near the settle by the fireplace and said, "What color's your money?" The boys looked surprised to discover that I could speak, as if the fireplace poker or a Windsor chair had offered to knit them up a muffler. "What's it to you?" said the not Bostonian. "You own the tavern now?" I weighed the risk that these rascals might cut and run with the pleasure such a prank would give me when presented to Mrs. Tomlinson, alongside their licked dry chicken bones and empty cups, and decided the rewards were many and the risks were few. It wasn't especially Christian of me to make a sport of vexing Mrs. Tomlinson, but I was powerless to help myself. Also, I had a running wager with some of the other girls about which of our masters could be cheated worse by our customers before next meeting day. These 2 rogues would win me a peach and a half. Fine, I said, waving my hand at a table not too far from the door on which a lone maggot twisted in the streaming afternoon sunlight. They sat down together to continue their feast of stories. That William Fly, turned pirate, said the sturdy Jamaican with evident admiration, out on his own account and caught just as fast, poor bastard. But why'd they do it? What do you think? Said his skinny friend. Bad usage. They shared a moment of silent mutual understanding. I was on the point of asking for more details, no doubt shocking them with my ability to not only speak but inquire, when a rum-thickened voice in the other room called, Hannah, Masury! I left them at the table with some bitterness. But as my hands moved thoughtlessly through their labors the rest of that day, cleaning and scrubbing and wiping and pouring, my thoughts lingered on this William Fly and his broadaxe. I started to wonder what it might be like to look upon his face and read in it the dare of freedom. My name isn't Hannah Masury. It's Hannah Masury. I was born a bit before 1710 in Beverly, I've been told, an easy day's sail or so from Boston, and though I suppose I had brothers and sisters and a mother and father, I couldn't tell you a thing about them because I was bound out when I still had milk teeth. I remember a mean little house with a smoking chimney, sleeping in a trundle crowded with hands and feet, and the smell of the ocean in the fog. That's all. Since then, it's been Mrs. Tomlinson, her baker's dozen children, and the bustle and ebb and flow of Ship Tavern. I have friends around the wharves, miscellaneous pups like me, lent and bossed and sometimes fed and clothed, tucked into attics and doorways and kitchens at night, and dragged out and scrubbed clean when it's time to go to meeting. Mrs. Tomlinson might be my dead mother's cousin, or perhaps she was her aunt. I don't remember. Though I never had any schooling and cannot read the Bible, Mrs. Tomlinson insists that I go to church on the Sabbath and hear the word. She says it's never too late to be redeemed. I know she means to help me, I do, but indolence is my greatest sin. Sabbath day is supposed to be a day of rest, and church drags on for hours, and the beetle whacks us on the head if we fall asleep, and I always fall asleep. She likes to go to the North Meeting House, where she can bask in the fame of Reverend Cotton Mather. He drove the witches out of Salem before I was born, a feat as impossible seeming to me as a man driving fairies out of holes in the ground. But for all Reverend Mather's good works, Satan's power still hangs heavy in Boston, and maybe it hangs heaviest on the wharves. I've glimpsed the devil myself a time or two in his cups at Ship's Tavern. Sabbath day is the ripest chance for gossip and rumor to be confirmed or denied in Boston. So the Sunday after I met the two boys from the rowboat, I thought to learn more of this William Fly. The whispering classes had told me he'd been brought ashore in irons and thrown into jail the very day the boys arrived. After tossing their master and mate overboard and claiming the ship Elizabeth as their own, they'd rechristened her the Thames Revenge, hoisted the black flag, and gone pirating off Cape Hatteras. They'd been betrayed by a fisherman they entrusted as their pilot after taking a rich prize off Carolina, who instead of leading them safe to Martha's Vineyard for water, took them all the way to Boston and fooled them into surrender. They were all sure to hang. Reverend Mather sought to bring them back to the Lord first. They might even be in church that day, their wrists all bound together, their ashamed heads hanging, heavy under the curious stares and barely concealed whispers of all of us. For once, I was actually excited to go to meeting. I even prettied myself up a bit, scrubbed my face and arms, and made up a cleanish tucker. You probably want to know what I look like, but what does it matter? I look hungry is what I look like. Skin and bones, sunburnt, rough-footed. I have hair on my head, and it's long, and I wear it in a pigtail down my back, or a braid wound at the nape of my neck, under a kerchief usually, or sometimes one of Mrs. Tomlinson's discarded linen caps. My face is freckle-stained like I've been sprinkled with gingerbread batter. My age is hard to tell. I could tell you I was anything from 15 to 25, and you might believe me. I have eyes that can see better than passing well. No one has ever called me especially pretty, but then again, I have boys whenever I want them, and I still have all my teeth. That Sabbath day, we were all on alert for the pirates as we gathered on the steps of the North Meeting House under the clanging of the church bells. Old North sits only a block away from Ship Tavern, a shabby wooden edifice as dark and stuffy as the houses crowded round about it. There's a new brick North Church a block further on, just finished a couple of years ago. Its proud white steeple lords over the entire town, visible as far away as Charlestown in the marshlands, and it has bright arched windows and fresh painted pews, its fineness befitting a celebrated cleric followed by fame and fortune. Side note, what I've just described as the New North Church is what is now in Boston called Old North Church. There was an older Old North Church, which was still standing at the time that Hannah was living, so this description of this shiny and new, wealthy edifice, because of Cotton Mather's fame and glory, is accurate. Cotton Mather, you probably recognize his name because he was one of the people who oversaw the Salem witch trials. He also rather famously wrote a number of treatises against piracy in the 18th century. And so one thing that I was interested in thinking about when writing Hannah's perspective is that Hannah was born after that Puritan theocratic moment. So she still uses this kind of puritanical language. She's still living in the shadow of puritanical thought, but she's living in a different time. She's from a different generation. And so her own relationship with Puritanism is different from the relationship that the generation older than her would have. "Here they're coming," one of the girls said next to me, and excited fingers clamped onto my elbow. It was hard to see through all the shoulders and backs and heads because I am skinny and not tall. I spotted first the profile of a well-fed gentleman in black broadcloth, with a fresh white kerchief at his neck and a plain black hat, his lips pressed together in the manner of one who speaks for the Lord. The people parted before him like the Red Sea, pushing back against me, my slight body moving in the current of the crowd. There's something exciting about being within a fingertip's length from such fame. Mrs. Tomlinson always returned from Sabbath meeting with a high color to her cheeks that had little to do, I thought, with whatever hymns might have been sung that day. The crowd knitted back together, and for a time I saw nothing but the hairy inside of an old man's ear, before everyone shifted again, and in the gap between two women's necks I spied a beaten man limping up the church steps. This would be Thomas Cole, William Fly's quartermaster. Neither old nor young, Thomas Cole had creases around his careworn eyes. I'd heard he had a wife somewhere, and 7 children to feed. The whisperers told me that William Fly had suspected him of mutiny and delivered 100 lashes to his back, and so Cole hobbled with the grimaces of a man in terrible pain. The crowd blurred and parted again, affording me a fleet glimpse of a man hang-dogging in Cole's footsteps. This rogue was about 40, with hard blue eyes. He sported the long pigtail of a man who has spent his life at sea, weedy like kelp with bristly red whiskers. Someone standing behind me informed someone else that this was Henry Greenville. "Married too," they said. I couldn't imagine being married to a man like him. Any wife of his would spend her days making sure not to turn her back to the door. Just behind Henry Greenville staggered a boy about 20, so stewed in strong drink that even after so many days in Boston jail, I could smell him as he passed me by. This would be George Condick, so blind drunk they hadn't even been able to hold a gun when they took the Elizabeth. He served as cook for the pirate company. His nose was a starburst of busted blood vessels, and his eyes were rimmed and red, as if he had been crying. I was borne along in the crush of bodies, streaming toward the doors of the meeting house, the donging of the steeple bell in my ears. The girls I came with were carried off in the crush, and I couldn't even find Mrs. Tomlinson in the tangle of arms and legs, skirts and chins, and sweating temples touched with gray. "But where's William Fly?" I asked. No one bothered to answer me. "Where's the captain?" I raised my voice. "I would look upon William Fly." "Not coming," a pinch-nosed matron with a bonneted baby in her arms said to me. "Not coming?" I exclaimed. "He refused," she said, as a sweet rope of drool dripped from her baby's lower lip onto my shoulder. I marveled at this novel idea. He had refused. "But why?" I asked the matron's shoulder as it pressed up against my cheek. "Said he wouldn't have the mob gaze upon him," she replied. I was funneled with some other youths of obscure parentage and no prospects along the back wall of the meeting house, while the quality elbowed their way to the tidy pews that they paid for. Cole, Greenville, and Condick were maneuvered to a pew near the front, that we might all gaze upon their hanging heads while Reverend Mather read his text and took the measure of their souls. We were the mob, sitting in judgment upon these hard-used men. I saw the staring, curious faces of men and women I'd known to some degree or other for most of my life. At Sabbath meeting, in ship tavern, on the wharf, at the market, on the street. The whispering classes know everything that happens in small towns like Boston, and I knew all of these people. Adulterers and liars, some of them. Full of wrathful thoughts they hid under their tidy lace-tipped bonnets and felted hats. Eyes glaring covetously at one another's healthy children, or unburned houses, or bustling businesses, or gold rings. Sabbath breakers like me, lazy as dogs and loving our sleep. Mouths full of oaths when they thought God wasn't listening. Shirkers of work. Players at dice or cards for money. Secret hearts aflame with lust at the curve of a cheek or the bend of a wrist. In their sober New England eyes, I read all the stolen kisses, pocketed apples, long-nursed resentments, weaknesses, sorrows, and shame that ribboned through their lives, livened on occasion with transient candle flames of joy and pleasure and passion and maybe even grace. We all stood, we mob, and sang, and then we all sat down, those of us with pews to sit in, and Reverend Mather mounted the pulpit and gazed down with the authority of God upon the lowered heads of the embittered pirates. George Condick loudly sniffling and wiping his wet nose on a sleeve. "They die," intoned the famous cleric, beginning the sermon that would entertain us all that Sunday afternoon, and which would echo in our heads for days afterward, "even without wisdom." But William Fly wasn't there. William Fly refused. Chapter 2. Well, here's a question. Would you rather I continue with chapter 2, or would you like me to skip ahead a little bit so that we get to some of the 20th century framing story? What's your pleasure? Can I see a show of hands? Carry on with chapter 2? Okay, all right. Chapter 2. Then it was July, and the time had come for them to die. Mrs. Tomlinson wanted to go see the hangings as badly as I did, which is why she made such a point of refusing me. "You can't possibly," she said with her back turned, "not with every bed full twice over." It was true that the cots in the warren of rooms upstairs were stacked with sailors 2 and 3 deep, sleeping head to toe or sometimes in shifts. Shifty-eyed creatures haunted our hallways, pinching me when I passed. Some of them had arms that were stained blue with tattoos. Ghostly ankle road wound around their wrists, heavy-breasted women garlanded in flowers winking from their shoulders. "They'll all be going too," I pointed out. "I'll wager the whole place will be empty all afternoon." Mrs. Tomlinson gave me her don't talk back glare and returned to her work. "No," she said. I sulked with my lip out, but she affected not to notice. I was on the point of arguing that such a performance of abject repentance could only do good things for my immortal soul. How could I not go? Would she have me miss such a display of God's goodness? Would she have me stay a sinner? Mrs. Tomlinson once said I could argue a beggar out of a penny before wishing she could have a penny for every gray hair I'd given her. "Hannah!" a grizzled voice shouted from the smaller dining room, curtailing my case. "Hannah Misery, God damn you, girl, Hannah!" "Go and see what he wants," Mrs. Tomlinson told me, and then see to the piss pots upstairs. I stalked from the kitchen down the back hall to the dining rooms, muttering, "I'll see to your piss pots," and pushed open the door into the low raftered room where men sat scattered about, bent over cards and cups or laboring over letters home. "Hannah!" the sot was still shouting. Not one of the new arrivals, most of whom weren't drunk enough to be rude until after the noonday meal. This was a pickled regular, so firmly installed in the Windsor chair in the corner that he might have grown into it like a vine. "Hannah!" he yelled as loudly with me standing before him as he would if I were in the stable out back. "Ephraim what?" I said to the drunkard. "I'm dry," he said through a roomy cough, waving his mug at me. "Oh, you're dry," I cried, pulling the dented pewter mug from his fist. "Here in the sight of Christ and all that's holy. Dry. Everyone, you hear that? Ephraim's dry. Did you ever hear of such a thing?" I raised my voice so that everyone in the dining room could hear and chuckle. It was Ephraim's favorite mug, the one chased with a bunch of grapes. I clutched it to my chest and stalked away muttering. One of my hands yanked at my snarled apron strings while I strode to the front door of Ship Tavern. I shouldered open the door and burst out onto Fish Street, shoving past knots of boys lounging on the barrels outside. I flung my tangled apron aside and went to the edge of Clark's Wharf and pitched the mug into the water, shouting, "Now see how dry you are." Some boys laughed and hooted because there's nothing funnier to them than a girl who is enraged. But as soon as the mug disappeared into the water, I felt ashamed of myself. My cheeks burned. My temper was second only to my laziness for making me such a good-for-nothing, Mrs. Tomlinson always reminded me. A small boy, even skinnier than me, dove off a piling in his breeches to see if he could pluck the cup from the silty bottom. It would be at least an hour before I was missed in a way that would get me lashed for shirking my duties and disobeying my mistress and stealing the mug from the old rummy. If I was going to be punished, I determined to make the most of it. I hustled down Ship Street and past the North Battery, dodging red-coated soldiers and sunburnt sailors and carts stacked high with silvery codfish. Women leaned out of windows, gulls wheeled in low, hunting for scraps, and here and there boxes of slick black oysters stacked 3 deep rustled as their claws scrabbled for escape. The naked wooden ribs of a ship stood sentinel in Thornton's shipyard, silhouetted in the sun like the carcass of a whale. The heat had broken, and Boston once again crawled with life, and much of that life was stirring to make its way through the streets to watch the hangings. In Lynn Street by Lemon Cart, I met 2 of the other girls I knew, absconders like myself, one in a ribbon straw hat plainly stolen from her mistress. "I heard he's very handsome," Mary Brown said, because she was the sort of person who was always wondering aloud whether someone was very handsome or not. She tied her hair in rags every night to make corkscrew curls and pinched her cheeks in the morning, just in case. "I heard he hasn't been eating," said Sarah Wilds with proprietary authority from under the straw hat. "Bet he's been drinking his grog, though," I said with some sympathy, and the other girls laughed. "What?" I exclaimed. "I would." "Oh, we know you would, Hannah," Sarah said with her long arm around my neck. By the time we came to Hudson's Point, the streets were jammed as tightly with people as the lobsters were in their traps, slick with sweat and shining with fear and excitement. A chestnut horse with a rope bridle stood in the street, hemmed in by people around him, unable to turn or back up, lifting his tail and disgorging the contents of his bowels with an anxious nicker. The eager faces crowding around us all belonged to strangers. A lot of them were men and boys discharged from the ships in the harbor. Any sailing master worth his salt would have wanted his crew ashore that day to see how authority dealt with mutineers. William Fly would be forced to kneel before the feet of the magistrates and reverends and tell all of us that the only right way of living was to obey. Go to Sabbath meeting. Don't drink. Don't swear. Don't talk back. Don't take what isn't yours. Obey the Lord thy God. Obey thy reverends and masters. Obey thy parents and thy husband and thy Mrs. Tomlinson and thy whoever else should happen to come along and demand that thou obey. There were plenty of women and girls, too, and old men and withered women and servants and slaves given liberty for the day, and a few Wampanoag with babies on their backs. Many of the people carried baskets over their arms packed with bread and cheese, as if on their way to a festival, or a church day of Thanksgiving, or a country wedding. People who had come to make a day of it. People who had traveled in from the outlying villages and farms, setting out in the pale gray of not yet dawn, just so they could hear the subjugation of the pirates and watch the bending neck of William Fly. "We'll never get through this way," I said. Already the bodies pressing in around us were making it hard to move. "Let's cut," Sarah suggested. She steered us out of the street along a narrow alley, stinking of urine, over a low stone wall and into the old burying ground. We dodged through thin slate headstones carved with grinning skulls and crossed long bones. Relict of this and son of that and Bible quotes none of us could read, but which we were all somehow expected to know. Here and there, blooming dandelions and berry brambles, not a hanged man amongst them. I tripped on a footstone and skinned my knee. "Hurry," Mary said, lifting me by an armpit. I hobbled after her, sucking my teeth to dull the pain. Over another wall, slippery with loose stones, and into Prince Street in the shadow of a slowly rotating windmill. And here the crowds were thinner, maybe because most of the inns and ordinaries were closer to the wharves. We were approaching the mill pond. The mill pond was a greasy shimmer in the afternoon sun, dotted with napping ducks tucked amongst the cattails. Its banks were lined with wooden wharves and tenders small enough to navigate the creek, leaning wood frame houses and the Baptist meeting house. The air smelled of grinding corn and boiling molasses and leather. But the mill pond dam was high enough for our purpose, overlooking Gee's shipyard with its spars draped in rigging like spider webs, and masts pointing into the cloudless sky. Beyond the shipyard stretched the tidal flats where the Charles River crept its lazy way to the sea. Usually a naked expanse of mud dotted with gasping freshwater clam holes, today the flats teemed with humanity, crowding together at the foot of a hastily assembled wooden stage and scaffold. On the crossbeam over the stage, from which dangled 3 knotted hemp ropes, hung a black flag, expertly stitched with a white sailcloth skull and crossbones, like the grinning hollow faces of the burying ground headstones we'd just fled past. Side note, it took me a while to figure out where William Fly was hanged, because some of the maps show that hangings took place in the tidal flats of the Charles River, which is where I had put them. Some of the maps show hangings taking place at the Neck, Boston Neck. And I actually went on Twitter and asked a historian that I know, Joyce Chaplin, if hangings in the 18th century, the beginning of the 18th century in Boston, took place on the Neck. And she wrote back, don't all hangings take place on the Neck? I was like, dang it, Professor Chaplin, that doesn't help. Okay. I was worried we'd miss it, Sarah said. Mrs. Tomlinson was all set to stop my coming, I said. Ha, said Mary, damn her eyes and her Bible too. Mary was better at oaths than you would think, to look at her. It wouldn't be long now, not if the nooses were already up. I'm skipping just a tiny bit. For a time, the crowd watched and speculated and tried not to grow bored. Then around noon, a rill of excitement rippled through the people with a roar and a cheer. We couldn't see at first around the ships in the yard, and I got to my feet to see if that would help my aspect any, but it didn't. The roars grew louder, and presently a 3-sided wooden cart, like a hay wain, dragged by a tired mare, lurched into view, drawing ruts behind it in the mud. The crowds parted but slowly to allow the wagon to pass, and dotted in amongst the people walking before the mare, we spied 3 eminences in black with books tucked under their arms. One of them bore the unmistakable bearing of Reverend Mather. Hands from the crowd reached out to touch him, and he touched hands and heads in a manner as Christ-like as anybody. Behind these divines, whose sacred duty it was to usher some impoverished unfortunates into hell, the cart carried 3 men, standing swaying with each lurch of the mare. I thought I knew the bent-over hobble of Samuel Cole, still seeping and raw, and next to him the reedy drink that was Henry Greenville. I saw no sign of young George Condick, who I heard had been reprieved, and a good thing, too. At least pity was available to some of us sinners. The 3rd man was swathed in shadow. Then a rock of the cart caused the shadows within to move, and at last my eyes could feast upon the face of William Fly. Mary was right. He was handsome. Handsome in a hard-used way, at any rate. Perhaps 10 years older than myself, slim and wiry, sea-hardened, he stood with his head high, his dark locks pulled back from a seemingly unconcerned brow. He had a well-formed nose, and like all men of his trade, was tanned almost nut brown. He seemed to be smiling. No, smirking. He nodded here and there, his mouth moving as though greeting friends and well-wishers, making his compliments. What's that he got in his hand? Sarah said, now on her feet next to me. I squinted with my hand over my eyes to shade away the sun, and perceived that under the ruffled cuffs of his shirt, where his hands were manacled together at the wrists, William Fly was holding a nosegay of violets. This is all true, by the way. No sooner had I made this incredible determination than he brought the posy to his nose with a delicate sniff. As he did so, I thought his eyes might have settled on mine and held them. I smiled out of one side of my mouth, feeling as though his flamboyant nosegay were a joke meant only for me. Of course, he couldn't see me. I was but one face in the mob, as unknown to him as if I'd stayed at my labors in the tavern. I like to imagine he did, though. This is all ridiculous, his sniff seemed to say. No one truly understands how ridiculous it is but you and me. I've thought of our joke often since. It is ridiculous, Will, I agreed silently from the safety of the dam. The cart drew up to the scaffold and creaked to a stop. Bring them up, one of the men on stage said. One by one, Fly, Cole, and Greenville were led down from the back of the cart through the crowd and up the ladder to stand where we all could feast on them in their misery and despair. Cole and Greenville looked pale and drawn under their tanned skin, their eyes on their feet, but Fly gazed haughtily out over the silently watching crowd. A breath of wind sparkled across the surface of the river and stirred the black flag hanging over their heads. 3 nooses swayed gently. William Fly stepped up behind one of the nooses and took the measure of it with one look. "Oh, come now," Fly said to the hangman, taking the noose in his hands. "Don't you know your trade?" Quick as a wink, he untied the noose and retied it expertly as a sailor would. The mob exclaimed in delighted shock, but the ministers weren't having it. They shushed and demanded our silence. "William Fly," Reverend Mather intoned when we had settled down, "will you speak what you should judge proper to be spoken on this sad occasion? At the very least, will you make the warning of survivors that they might escape the fate which now stands before you?" William Fly brought his nosegay to his lips before dropping it over the edge of the scaffold into the hands of the crowd. "Yes," he said, so that we could all hear, "I would advise the masters of vessels to carry it well to their men, lest they should be put upon doing as I have done." I'm going to skip forward a little bit, but that is something that William Fly actually said from the scaffold. And I thought, while planning to write this book, I thought, what would it feel like for someone like Hannah? Hannah's fictional, but there were people who lived lives like Hannah's, people who were bound out, couldn't live with their families, who had to work as servants for very low pay. I wondered what it would feel like to be someone like Hannah and watch this person who had seized his own will for himself and refused to apologize for it. So essentially what William Fly is saying is that he turned to piracy because he was so badly treated by the sailing master on his ship that the sailing master deserved it, and he wasn't sorry at all, which I thought was actually a pretty brave thing to do. Okay, I'm going to skip forward a little bit. Okay. Hannah discovers that she has to, a few things happen, and Hannah discovers that she has to flee for her life. Chapter 4. Life returns to the waterfront well before the dawn. I knew I had to make a plan before the people started to stretch and wake to find me in terror, alone in the street, naked and worth money if they would give me up to pitiless men. The distant ship bell kept me apprised of the time, donging away the last hours of my life. By 4 o'clock and all's well, I could scarcely move from the strain of keeping myself knotted up so small and tight. She's hiding inside the apple barrel. Basically, she witnesses a murder. I don't want to tell you who. She witnesses a murder and then she has to flee for her life. Apple miasma filled my nose and mouth and eyes and ears, and I feared would make me drunk just from breathing it. I had neither food nor money nor clothes nor shoes, and a price levied upon my head. Those men with the cutlasses knew my name, and they knew where I made my home. Silently, I lifted the barrel lid a hair's breadth and scoped the wharf. A few lamps were glowing in shipboard cabin skylights on the brigantines and sloops resting at anchor in the harbor or moored up close to the wharf. Somewhere nearby, a cow lowed to be milked. The roosters would stir before long, and the sky was already beginning to think about paling. The stars looked tired. The moon had set. In a few minutes, the first sleepy servants, apprentices, and fishwives would pad out to the privy and back to the kitchen and stoke up banked embers and set things to boil. Another day in Boston would begin. I didn't have much time. My first thought had been that I would swim to Dorchester and flee from there on foot to the countryside. But as the cool water closed over my head, she jumps into the water. I spun in the silent, bubbling blackness, my hair fanning out and my shift ballooning up like a jellyfish. I knew my plan was folly. I would drown if I was lucky. My lips broke the surface and I gasped for air. Overhead on the wharf, a sleepy young sailor trudged past, and I clung to the piling underneath, hiding in the shadows, listening to his receding footfalls. Barnacles scraped my palms, stinging in the salt water. The boy didn't look round. I peered out from under the wooden planks to see if I knew him. In his sailor's loose blouse and breeches and kerchief and bare feet, he could have been any one of hundreds of anonymous boys who wash ashore in a different port, hardly aware that they're anywhere but far from home. He could have been anyone, or no one at all. I pulled myself, dripping from the water, and ran, hunched down, dashing from shadow to shadow until I reached the yard behind the tavern. The laundry was nearly dry, what little the pirates had left hanging. White sheets had stiffened, woolen stockings crispy. The brickyard was a heaped expanse of white and flax, like a softly rolling meadow of clover and bloom, marked only by the awful form of what had once been poor, starving Billy Chandler sprawled on his empty stomach, his reddened teeth grimacing at me, wreathed in freshly beaten sheets. Sorry, that's from the chapter that skipped. I couldn't look at him. I was afraid of the accusation I might see in his open eyes, afraid that in trying to smuggle him to the kitchen, I had instead delivered him into the hands of the devil, afraid that now his soul sat in torment because of me. When this broken boy's body was found, there was sure to be screams and a rush of commotion and onlookers and summoning of the constable. I had best be well gone by then. Shivering in the thin early morning light, I stripped away my ruined shift and left it on the line, stained and mottled and soaked, the damp harbor air chilling my naked gooseflesh. I grabbed a blouse and pulled it over my head, and then a pair of breeches that might have been just small enough, and a pair of woolen stockings, hopping on one foot, then the other, to roll them up over my knees. The sky was paling faster, and the distant ship bell warned me that dawn was nigh. Fear buzzed in my ears. Any minute now we'd be discovered, and I might be taken for murderous and hanged within the week. She's pulling the boots off of the body of the boy, and I'm skipping some of the kind of grosser parts just because delicate sensibilities. I scrambled backward on my hands and feet in horror like a panicked crab, grabbing up the loose boots under my arm, rolling to my feet, and sprinted away from Ship Tavern just as the first rooster on the barn stretched out his lustrous wings and opened his throat to crow. When they came, just after the rising sun kissed the windows of Boston pale pink, the screams and shouts shuddered the waterfront. Bells clanging, rushing feet, and people saying, "What is it? What's happened?" And a boy I heard, a stranger, in the alleyway. Was he robbed? He must have been, for he had nothing on him at all, not even his shoes. I was crouching near the town dockyard by Lawn Wharf, loitering since I couldn't very well hide. Billy's shoes were too big by half, and I had to hold up the breeches with a line of hemp, the blouse sleeves rolled up to my elbows. I'd tied my hair in a pigtail and rolled a stolen kerchief about my neck. I'd found a half-eaten heel of bread and was gnawing on it in the shadow of a blacksmith shop, my eyes darting this way and that like a hunted animal cornered in a glade. "Here, you," a man said. I stared up at him, cowering with the bread heel in my hands. He wore a soot-smirched leather apron and had a massive blacksmith's forearms folded over his chest. I said, mouthful of stale bread. Nothing I'd eaten had ever tasted so good. "Move along," the blacksmith shooed me away. "I'll not have you idling here." I stared at him like a cornered cat. "Go on," he said. "Get to your ship or I'll flog you myself." I stuffed the end of my bread into my shirt, confused, but touched my knuckle to my forehead, playing along. "Yes, sir," I said to the man in the apron, crumbs tumbling out of my mouth. "Thank you, sir." I clopped into the crowd on the town dock landing, most of them going about their morning business, some of them trying to make their way to Clark's Wharf to see what all the commotion was about. I looked curiously into each face as I passed, reading it for signs of recognition. Many were folk I recognized from Sabbath meeting or the market, faces that formed familiar features in the landscape of my life. There was the fisherman with the long gray beard. There was the old woman in the plain coif and collar of a generation ago. There was the man in the Ramillies wig who was handsome despite his perpetual squint. There was the half-Wampanoag man who worked at the Coopers with his pepper gray hair. But now they were as strangers to me. Their eyes slid past me or looked over my head. I was invisible. Like all the anonymous, hungry boys who rolled off the ships and rolled through town and then rolled away once more, never to be seen again. I'm skipping ahead a little bit. As I pondered my newfound invisibility, I determined to make a test of it. I strolled over to the ropemaker's alley and went up to the first boy I saw. He was bent over, splicing, absorbed in his work. "Ho there," I said. He didn't look up. "What?" he said. "You know where I might find the reporter?" I asked. The boy's hands moved lightning quick, his eyes nearly unblinking. "Fruit packet for the Azores," he said. "Long Wharf, starboard side, all the way at the end." I lingered, marveling that he didn't look at me twice. Did he not see I was a girl? Could he not hear it in my voice? Was I not as much the coquette as Mrs. Tomlinson would have let me believe? "Leaves tomorrow, I think they said," the boy continued, his hands never stopping. When at last he looked up at me, his face betrayed no remark or curiosity. "And all full up," he added. "Right," I said. But I happened to know they were down a cabin boy. I hurried out of the rope maker's alley, tripping light as my soul sang in triumph. I found it, a way out of Boston that didn't take me by the neck, where the pirates lay in wait for me. I could escape, maybe, if I was careful, if I could make myself be what they wanted to see. Long Wharf, if you've never seen it, is like a city unto itself, wide enough for horses to ride down it 3 abreast, so long it nearly has its own horizon. The length of Long Wharf is crowded with sail-offs and victualling houses and coffee houses and rope makers and barrel makers and counting houses and stampers and engravers and chandlers, everything that's needed for kitting out ships and the men who sail them. I'd never spent much time there, in truth. Each wharf was like its own country. Sometimes on a hot summer night, we would go down Clark's and sit on the bitter end with our feet dangling over the water. When I first arrived with Mrs. Tomlinson, I used to like to throw pebbles in the water to watch the pale blue sparkles of phosphorescence trace their bubbles into the deep. If you have your own wharf, why go all the way over to another one? I moved down Long Wharf a stranger. The city of Long Wharf was bustling even as the morning began to threaten rain. As I clopped in Billy's loose boots, looking for his ship, I felt an electric tingle along my scalp, the eerie lightning in the head from a sudden drop in barometric pressure. I scented the coming rain, a sharpness and blackness in the air. The wind kicked up and women's hands flew atop their straw hats to keep them from rippling away. A few young men appeared topside in flapping oilcloths. The gentle waves of the harbor rose into sharp black peaks whitened with foam. I stopped at what seemed a likely ship, a great bark sparkling with fresh paint, several boys and young men busy on her deck. But when I made my inquiries, I was met with riotous laughter. Carry on a little farther, one of the young men urged me while the others exchanged glances. You can't miss her. Well, they were right. When I finally found my salvation, berthed stern to and half-heartedly lashed to the piling with hemp lines hairy from hard use, I confess my resolve faltered. She was a shabby schooner, not even 100 tons, 2 masts, paint-chipped, worm-eaten, creaking where she lay like a tired tree that would snap at the first big blow. A few panes missing from her stern glass and skylights. No one was about. The scroll work was sun-faded and peeling, but I could make out re or in faint shadow letters across the stern. But then we have a very abrupt switch. Cambridge. It just cuts off like that? Marion looked up at the student sitting across from her desk. It's not only the cover, said Kay. Some pages are missing too. So at this point in the story, we discover that we thought we were buried inside a narrative, but actually we've been reading this narrative, and we're reading over the shoulder of a couple of other characters. Marion thumbed through the sheath of yellowed paper resting atop a scattered mess of student research papers written in interchangeable sweet looping script. She'd been ignoring the papers for weeks. She didn't even remember which class they were for. They're not just sewn out of order? Kay said, I don't think so. I've read the whole thing. It largely seems to be in order, I think. Just here and there, some of it's gone. Cut out or lost. I don't know. Marion said, that's unfortunate. It was worse than unfortunate. It was a fragment. But there's not that much missing, the undergraduate insisted. But there's no way to know how much, said Marion. She sat back in her swivel chair and propped a knee on her desk. A tuft of lint turned up on her slacks leg in the yellowing beam of late afternoon sun. Marion plucked it off. Keep reading, said Kay. Marion eyed the student perched across from her in the only office chair not heaped with books and papers, her young feet folded at the ankles like they tell you to do in charm class, one saddle shoe jiggling. Kay Lonergan wasn't the sort of student Marion usually noticed, not that Marion put much notice on the undergraduates as a rule. What the Harvard boys would call a nice girl, she was a stolid young woman with Irish cheeks and a New Jersey home address. Slept with pins in her hair, no moth holes in her cardigan, slim tweed skirt, admired Myrna Loy and thought Jean Harlow was fast. Signet ring. Kay Lonergan would be the sort of girl who busied herself in the Radcliffe Library and sang in a choir or two and went to lots of student meetings that felt very important at the time. She would collect her degree without honors and disappear back to New Jersey. She would date largely interchangeable boys who took her to football games and thought swallowing a live goldfish on a dare was the height of comic genius. If she majored in history, it would be so she could teach school in Montclair until she got married. Then, in the years to come, as she gazed out the window over her kitchen sink at her children playing under a red-leaved maple tree, She could close her eyes and conjure a perfect image of the court in Tudor England, draped in tapestries and redolent with the smell of roasting venison. And then she'd put the lunch plate in the drying rack. Look, look, Marion said, pushing the manuscript away. You have to know that it's probably fake. Kay's eyebrows went up in the middle, but she said, I don't think it is actually. First of all, Marion thumbed back over the pages she had briefly read. How is it a true narrative written by herself if she's illiterate? I mean, Kay said. Her foot kept jiggling. It was maddening. She wrote it later. People learn to read and write their memoirs later. Sure, said Marion, but they also invent stories too wild to be true to sell books, even in the 18th century. I know, Kay said. Captivity narratives, Marion was bored. Conversion narratives. I'm guessing that's what this manuscript winds up being, a conversion narrative. Have you even taken my class? Kay's thumbnails clicked together. It was probably written by a man, Marion continued. Look. She licked a thumb and riffled back a couple of pages. The paper was thick and heavy, wavy with water damage and browned with foxing. The manuscript certainly felt old enough. And the type looked consistent in font and spacing with other 18th century books, with a title page claiming publication and a sale by printer that sounded plausible, in a street in Boston known for printing, even if it wasn't an imprint Marion had heard of before. But those details wouldn't be too hard to ape. Handwriting that actually belonged in the 18th century was much more difficult to fake, but not impossible. Marion pointed to the passage in which Hannah addresses her friend Sarah in the street, and Sarah doesn't know her. That's one of the parts I skipped over.
Yeah.
Come on, said Marion. She'd just seen her the day before. The text has implied they weren't just friends but lovers. They'd bundled together, it said. What sort of male fantasy is that? Not that it didn't happen, but the idea that she'd put it in writing is preposterous. And if it were true, how could Sarah possibly not know her in the street? Marion realized how harsh her dismissal must sound, and she inwardly chastised herself for being so blunt. She always forgot how sensitive the newly opened petals of intellectual curiosity could be, delicate and flush, easily shriveled by the hot glare of disapproval.
Thank you
Marion
so
looked.
much, Catherine.
Are we done? Okay, thank you.
No, I mean, I love your descriptions are really wonderful. It's great. It's
Thank
great. They
you.
evoke so much of the characters and the space. It's wonderful.
Well,
And
I appreciate being afforded so much time to share it with you all. Thank you.
thank you. And I want to thank everyone for joining us for our March Arts Saturdays authors reading. If you'd like to find out more information about Catherine's books, you can go to our bookstore. Here we go. That's let's see, where we go. That's bookshop.org/shop/Drakeit Arts. Also, I would like to give a special thank you to all of our donors who make these programs possible. If you'd like to be a donor, please email us at drakeetarts@gmail.com. All of our programs are, all of our monies go straight to the artists, actually, and all of our programs are supported by these volunteers and these generous people. For more information about our Arts Saturdays and other programs, please email us at drakeetarts@gmail.com or visit our website. That's drakeetarts.com. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Wow.
Okay.